When faced with simultaneous crises, wars, climate disaster, hunger, and health emergencies, it's imperative that the global community be ready to deploy a swift and effective response. That's as clear as it's ever been in recent years, and this session invites an expert opinion on exactly what it takes. Just how do we navigate the complex process of saving lives in emergencies? Here to help us answer that question, please welcome our British diplomat currently serving as Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator at the United Nations. Thank you so much for being here, Martin Griffiths. Welcome, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me here.
There's so much to cover, so why don't we start with hunger? Because the fight against global hunger is dangerously off track. Humanitarian organizations have been scaling up to save lives, but it's still not enough. So tell us about the hunger crisis you witnessed from your field missions and how we can collectively step up to prevent famine and fight food insecurity.
I agree with you that hunger is a very good place to start and a very frightening prospect for millions of people. Over 50 million people around the world face dangerous levels of the lack of food. I just came back from Somalia, and while I was there in Somalia, there was an announcement that famine will happen in certain parts of Somalia between October and December of this year unless some miracle takes place. And that famine, we know from all our history, and Somalis know from all of their history, is something which is even worse than hunger. It's a disaster, to borrow a phrase from the Secretary General, on steroids. And in Somalia, the cause of this is absolutely clear. It's climate change. 4 failed rainy seasons in one after the other, a 5th about to fail before the end of this year, and maybe a 6th early next year. Somalia has never suffered this, and Somalia is only one of the countries facing famine. And famine demands different things from us. But the first thing it demands is solidarity and funding. And you know, I grew up looking at the pictures of famine in 1984, 1985 in Ethiopia, where the media delivered to us, the people, the pictures of need, terrible pictures. I can still remember them. Many of us can. We haven't had that experience yet in Somalia. I think if we can mobilize public opinion, we can get help to the people of Somalia in time. That's the guarantee that I think we can give the public. We need you there.
It's so interesting that you point to media in this situation, because a lot of the time we're saying that the conversation is more visible than it's ever been, that we have more access to media, and yet it sounds like what you're saying is actually what's being covered is not necessarily delivering the message, especially on issues like this. Is that correct?
Well, I think there are two or three problems because we're not covering it properly. And I include myself in that. First
Absolutely.
Of all, in places like Somalia, famine is going to happen in what are euphemistically called hard-to-reach areas. These are areas in the middle of the conflict with al-Shabaab. And getting media to those places, as well as getting humanitarian workers to those places, is really difficult because of security concerns. The government of Somalia has recently declared open war, all-out war against al-Shabaab. We can understand that, but we want to be able to go to those places to shine a light on the terrible plight that we think is happening there on our watch. The same problem, by the way, in Tigray in northern Ethiopia. If we can't get there, and if you can't get there, the world won't be generous and won't know what's happening and won't prick our conscience. So that's one problem. The other problem, very quickly, is competition. Ukraine, with all the horrors of what's going on in Ukraine and the Russian war there, has drowned out the rest of the world. Attention has so much going, and again, the media are involved in this, of course, on the terrible things that are happening in Ukraine, which are important, there's no doubt about it, and we have a lot of people there helping out. But it means that Afghanistan and Sudan and Syria and Somalia and the Sahel, they don't really get a look in, and they need to. And can I give you one really telling example of that for me?
Please, absolutely.
About a year ago, the Taliban took over Afghanistan. You'll remember that mid-August to mid-September, that we were all treated to the site of the Taliban takeover. In that period, Haiti suffered one of the worst earthquakes ever. It barely made the news, and yet it destroyed much of the fabric of that benighted country. So managing news priorities is central to the lives that people like I lead as well.
It's so powerful that you point to that, because that is a place where we as citizens do have some ability to move the needle, because we are all citizen reporters and citizen journalists now. So I think it's incredibly important to underscore that and to recognize that these things are not all equal, but they all need to be covered, and they need to be covered in perpetuity. But speaking of climate, actually, the climate crisis, as we've covered nonstop, is wreaking havoc. Whether it's Pakistan, the Horn of Africa, or the Sahel, as you mentioned, the world's most vulnerable, who certainly did not cause this crisis, are paying the highest price. And humanitarian organizations are stretched thin trying to help. So how can the rest of the world step up to curb the suffering the climate crisis will continue to cause?
Well, first of all, let me express total agreement with the proposition that you make about some people in the world didn't make this problem, but they sure are getting the kicker from it. And the Secretary General was in Pakistan recently. I went to carry his bags for him, and this was the strong argument he was making. These people don't deserve it in Pakistan. It's extraordinary floods that we've been seeing there. And Somalia the same. They didn't create climate change in Somalia. Now, what is perhaps yet more scandalous and yet more urgent is that these countries have not received a penny of the climate money that was promised in COP26 in Glasgow, and that the G7 countries, I think they promised over $600 billion for climate adaptation and climate financing. Well, countries, the sort of countries that I go to, have got none of it. And that's a disgrace, of course. And what we need to do in the United Nations, and I know the Secretary General is really keen to lead on this, is to go into COP27 with clear requirements for how to make the disbursement of climate money simpler and easier. And you know, and I want to just add one element to this. Climate's a problem, less so for me than for my children. And I'm sort of very conscious of how the youth of this world are going to have to cope with the sins again, rather like the Somalis. They didn't cause this. And it is youth, by the way, who brought together the response to the famines in Ethiopia in 94-85. Remember Bob Geldof and Live Aid and so on and so forth. It was youth who brought the dynamic there. And somehow we have forgotten, in the business of humanitarian assistance, in the business of dealing with climate, to leverage the impatience and the energy of youth to hold governments and older people like me accountable. We really need to return to those great traditions of advocacy and activism. And I think climate is obliging us to do that, and that's a good thing.
And we're seeing the response from youth, certainly even here in the action zone. So I love that you point to that. And Bob Geldof and all of that was also a new model in a way, right? And so thinking about new models is also, equally important and hopefully broadens the horizons. So as the world watches humanitarian needs soar in Ukraine, as you mentioned, your office and humanitarian partners on the ground are making every effort to ensure aid can reach those in need. So talk a little bit more about those efforts and challenges, and most importantly, what your message is to the world on behalf of those affected civilians that your organization is serving.
Yeah, we have about 13 million people in Ukraine in need of humanitarian assistance, and who humanitarian agencies, UN, international NGOs, and others are reaching on a monthly basis with food, with shelter, with nutrition, with medical care in different ways in different places. And that's quite an achievement. And the world is generous, by the way, when it comes to funding humanitarian aid in Ukraine. So we have about a 70 or 80% level of funding, which is great for the Ukraine operation. And on average, around the rest of the world, it's about 30% probably these days. So, that's kind of real life. But it doesn't underplay the needs of the Ukraine. People of Ukraine deserve and need our help as well. The issues that are really concerning us right now in Ukraine, the coming winter. People who are displaced or who have no housing or where the electricity is cut off because of the war need to be given the resources to survive the cold winter, the cold weather of the winter. That's the priority for the operation there. Secondly, we need to reach the people in the lower Donbass. This is the area where there are non-government controlled local authorities. We haven't been able to reach them through the whole war because of difficulties in terms of permission to get there. We need to get there. But third point, and I want to really stress this about Ukraine, and it's a sign of hope. It's what the Secretary General referred to as a beacon of hope, which is the agreements that we were able to reach between the Russian Federation and the Ukrainians, not by them together, but we separately with them, on the export of grain and fertilizer from Ukraine across the Black Sea and helping to get Russian grain and fertilizer out to the world. It means for me, especially for me as a former mediator, that even those at war with each other can make agreements for the benefit of the global South in that case. It can be done. One should never give up those efforts.
And what a lesson for us all. Now, I have to say, I would not be very good at my job if I didn't point back to that gap that you mentioned between the Ukraine funding and what we see in the rest of the world. Can you talk just a little bit about why you think that is and how we can use the energy around one to perhaps translate into the other?
I think the donors, the humanitarian donors and member states are, of course, overwhelmingly from the West, overwhelmingly from Europe. The US, of course, is the biggest in the world today, very generous, by the way, around the world. And their budgets have been reduced in terms of their global humanitarian contribution by their obligations that they see in the connection with the Ukraine war, in terms of looking after refugees who come into their countries in Europe and so forth, as well as providing aid into Ukraine. And there's no doubt that Ukraine has needed and still needs a lot of humanitarian aid. I think our budget is in the billions of dollars for Ukraine. So it's natural that the people in Europe should look to their neighbors and their neighbors' need. Now, that's fine. That's fair enough. But the message, of course, that we give is don't forget the rest of the world. Don't forget the plight of those who are perhaps off camera, if you like. And there is one thing which ties this together a bit. In the early days of raising money for Ukraine, in the early days of the war, there was an astonishing outpouring of generosity from ordinary people across Europe and America. A bit of this kind of Bob Geldof phenomenon we were talking about. Massive generosity from people who just didn't like to see the things that were going on to the poor people of Ukraine, the oppression, the killing, and so forth, and they acted with their pocketbooks. That's the motivation I think people like us need to be told to mobilize for the rest of the world. That's what we should be doing more of.
And speaking to it directly, I love that. Now, just to close out, you once wrote that in more than 40 years of aid work, I don't remember the world being so overwhelmed with problems and in such urgent need of action to solve them. But despite this grim picture, I still hold on to hope. Tell us why. What motivates you to devote yourself to this line of work, especially in light of how dire things might seem?
I don't know why it is, but I have been at this for those 40 years, and I've always thought of it as a privilege. And I got lucky when I left college and I went out to Indochina to start working, in fact, with UNICEF. And it was in a war zone. And I thought to myself, well, isn't this the best thing to do in the world, where you get up every day and you try to do something useful? You may not succeed, but you get a go at it and you're able to live. So I've always thought of it not as a pious commitment, but a huge privilege to be able to do this. And I always try to remind myself of that in a rather odd way, perhaps, that when I visit, as I do now all the time, again, places of great need and suffering and tragedy, I try to remind myself by looking at it in the eye that this is the suffering and the tragedy that needs to keep me going. And when I went to Somalia, I saw babies, small children, in the most desperate of plights. One died the day after we had seen her. The story of the babies that cry are the lucky ones, because the babies who die are the ones who don't cry. Now that that image, those images, that reminder of the fact that you've got the best job in the world is hugely important. And finally, on hope. Without hope, nothing really happens. And I learned that in all kinds of different ways, jobs around the world. I was a political envoy for Yemen, and I used to say that hope is the currency of a mediator. If you don't give people hope, they will never agree to do anything. Why would they? They'll just settle back. Hope keeps you alive in terms of your health, keeps you striving for things, and keeps you doing the right thing. There was a school in Yemen, right in the middle of the war, left alone. It was surrounded by minefields. The teachers hadn't been paid. The school children every day, shepherded by their parents, wound their way through those minefields to that school every day to turn up, to try to see the future. Those parents knew that they needed their children to have a future, and hope is the way to we get to a future, in my view.
USG Griffiths, we could talk to you all day, and I have to say the headline for me is it is a privilege to do this work, and you have been doing it for a long time, as you say, but it's wonderful to hear somebody like you be as optimistic and as encouraging as you are. So thank you for all that you do, and for everybody out there in the SDG Action Zone, we will see you in a moment.
Thank you so much. Thanks.